do want to ask you if the in these moments where we had ownership stakes, if we weren't so self-constrained by saying that we didn't have voting control, what would you have liked to have seen done? What, from a climate perspective, for instance, could be done at these energy companies to advance the interests of climate, a just transition, these kinds of things?
Yeah. So when we were thinking about, what would it look like to actually nationalize the fossil fuel industry? Like, what would you do? I think there are different pathways in which you can acquire these entities. You can take over a substantial part of their market share. You can use eminent domain. That's something that actually we don't talk about it that much, but eminent domain is used on basically a daily basis in the United States and is a form of nationalization. Even when they're trying to take over the Wendy's in Washington, D.C., I don't know if y'all know this, there's this terrible intersection where there's this Wendy's in the middle, and it has created mayhem on traffic. And so Washington, D.C. used eminent domain to buy up the Wendy's so that they could fix the intersection. That is, in fact, that is actually the public acquiring something that is private. So you can also use that for the ground that is being extracted from, as well as, using the Federal Reserve to kind of acquire the stocks, as we talk about. But okay, let's say we get it. We have it. It's in hand. There are a few principles that we said, you actually have to apply this. And the ultimate mandate has to be that you are going to wind these assets down. That is something that I think is really distinct from other nationalization attempts. In the past, it's been to, let's say, ensure that the economy doesn't fall apart, or to stabilize a specific sector. What we're saying is we actually want to ensure that the economy is going to continue to work, and we are going to wind this thing down over time in a way that prioritizes people over the polluters themselves, like the CEOs. So that's a really different type of mandate that we haven't seen a lot with nationalization in the past. And of course, we would want this to be aligned with climate success. So saying that all of the extraction that does have to happen from now until full wind down needs to stay within the limits of 1.5 degrees. And then we say that there needs to be communities that are in control, because when you are taking out one economy from an area, what are you putting in its stead? Are you going to put another form of extraction there, another form of corporate greed? No, we want to put in a regenerative economy. We want public, let's say community control. We want, local economies that are thriving. And that's got to be a core part of that transition.
Well, Johanna, I got to interrupt because my, corporate law brain is going off and saying, well, are there going to be a million legal challenges because of the presumptive interest of shareholders being paramount, and this idea that we're now saying as corporate board members, we're going to actively do things that are against the profit motive and shareholder interest for these greater public interest? What do you imagine the pushback there is going to be?
I'm sure that there will be this will be taken to the courts. That is true. But sometimes we have to take that risk. We have to absolutely do that. And there's a certain part of this that I almost feel okay, let the shareholders get some amount of funds in order for us to keep on going. Because for me, the climate and the people who are experiencing the extraction are far more important. And the national government has that ability. And that's actually been part of the way that nationalization has happened in the past. With the railroads, basically, the national government sweetened the deal so that the railroad CEOs and execs would get out of the way when World War I was coming around. So you could actually imagine something like that so that you can expedite the transition. This is not to say that, and when it comes to the shareholders, some of those are pensions. Some of those are workers' money that's there because of how interconnected our energy system is. Who I don't care about getting the payouts are as much the CEOs, as our dear friend Kate Aronoff likes to say, yeah, let's nationalize them and then send them the hell to The Hague. So.
Well, and Briahna, related to shareholder lawsuits, this is part of the case for nationalizing them is when you nationalize, you don't just take the company, right? You buy out the existing shareholders. So those shareholders would be out the door, and then it would just be the federal government. So you wouldn't have to worry about shareholder lawsuits anymore. Whereas if Exxon right now were to start making those steps with its current shareholders, then maybe it could face certain lawsuits about them not, exercising business judgment or what is the rule? So I mean, that's actually one of the cases, is that we can get out of some of these, not just corporate law issues, but just get those shareholders out the door, get them paid, and now we can focus on, what we need to do without having to worry about having these conflicting interests involved in the governance of the companies.
Yeah, I love the business judgment rule. It's like qualified immunity for CEOs. It's like just vibes. The standard is vibes. Would a business person do it? Yeah, probs. Okay, it's allowed. Okay, so you were talking, Johanna, you're walking us through like logistically how it could happen. And by the way, Matt, I think that's a really important point, because I think in people's minds, and maybe I'm just revealing my own like lizard brain, but in people's minds, when they hear nationalization, they hear, appropriation of private property that's, just stolen by like a despotic government, and people aren't compensated fairly. They're not, I don't think, imagining you're a shareholder, you got bought out. Like this is
it's an acquisition in most countries. Now, in some countries, they do nationalize without paying out existing shareholders. And so, I think the word is unfortunately ambiguous, because sometimes people will use it to just mean, what if we just seized and didn't pay out existing shareholders and bondholders? And, that can cause a lot of problems unless you're really serious about doing it for the whole economy, in like a kind of revolutionary sense. But if you're doing it piece by piece, that can cause a crisis for your financial markets and stuff like that, as people lose faith. But no, you're talking about acquisition. Companies acquire each other all the time. Yeah. It's the same process, basically. Or you can use some of the other processes that Johanna has talked about, bankruptcy and receivership and stuff like that. But, outside of a crisis moment that you can take advantage of, we're talking about an acquisition. It's maybe a little bit more forceful if you're using eminent domain, but they're getting paid out. They'll get paid out similarly if some other company wanted to buy them out. It's just that they don't have a choice to say no.
Well, and Matt, on that point, I mean, in the Constitution, like it's like constitutionally required for just compensation if you use eminent domain. So, the public has to, or the private entity needs to be paid by the public in these sorts of acquisitions. But it is an interesting question. What is just compensation for these oil and gas companies? Are they over leveraged when you're considering climate? If they're sending us to a 4-degree world and are going to like crash our entire economy, really, what are they worth if we're going to keep it under 1.5? So it is an interesting question. But, if we're trying to like move as quickly as possible, there is some salience in thinking about, getting shareholders, ensuring that they're compensated, and then, eliminating the CEOs that are at the top of these companies that have, sowed so much destruction.
Yeah, I like that point, Johanna, because the discussion of externalities, the failure to internalize and hold people accountable for all of these, particularly climate externalities, and the problem of proving causation from a legal context, it's just such a high bar, means that no one's ever having to pay for things. And you can imagine a world where it's in the government's interest to read the law in a way that doesn't make those causation barriers so high, because it is trying to, in fact, prove that it doesn't actually owe as much compensation to these kinds of companies, which I can imagine having all kinds of interesting, useful downstream legal effects, right. And not everyone not having to have a kind of Aaron Brockovich level of kind of savvy / luck to be able to win these kinds of cases. Matt, you just alluded to other ways to do this other than acquisition that, Johanna, you talked about in your paper, bankruptcy, and you mentioned some other things. What are those options?
Well, I think Johanna
yeah, Johanna.
Her paper, but
I could, if you want to go for it, but Matt, happy to jump in too.
Okay, yeah, so you can put companies in receivership when they go bankrupt. They actually did that with Fannie and Freddie recently. That's the like mortgage guarantor thing, when you get like a federally subsidized or federally guaranteed mortgage loan for your house. I guess you could pass laws that make it illegal to be privately owned, right? So we have all sorts of laws that govern how certain corporations can be organized. For example, with a legal corporation, a legal services corporation, for the most part, it's not allowed to be like a publicly traded firm. I don't know if people have figured out ways around that, but that's why you get all these partnership kind of things, the LLPs and stuff like that. That's because of regulation that doesn't allow you to just create a normal corporation and run legal services out of it. Again, like I said, I don't know if some people have figured out creative ways around that.
I know people have been trying.
Yeah. And they do that for hospitals as well. There's a prohibition on the corporate practice of medicine, which in effect means that you have to be very careful about how you arrange the corporate structure of any medical provider to make sure that it doesn't end up being considered corporate practice of medicine. And so you could do something similar with this sector and use that new rule to essentially force it into public ownership. I think those are the main ones. I don't know if Johanna has.
Can you help unpack how the bankruptcy track works?
Yeah. So to kind of dig into that a little bit, bankruptcy is a mechanism that many corporations have used. We actually don't really want to see in the current structure fossil fuel companies going into bankruptcy, because usually what they're doing through that is reconstituting themselves and then coming out a different entity and having stripped out a lot of their environmental concerns, because those are usually the first things to go when they go through bankruptcy, particularly Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And we saw this a lot with the coal industry. As they were going through, they would say that, they have to pay for the most critical components first. And so what they would do is pay out bonuses to their executives as some of the most critical pieces in order to do to handle the bankruptcy. So it's pretty BS stuff. But
isn't that what happened, by the way, with Stephen Donziger in winning the unprecedentedly large lawsuit in Ecuador? It became a different, it was Exxon and then became Chevron? Or maybe it was Texaco and then became Chevron?
I'm pretty sure that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they said, well, we're a different company. We don't owe you this judgment. And that is par for the course for these corporations.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that's been under consideration, and I think that a few people in Congress have thought about putting out, is some type of receivership when these entities are going into bankruptcy. So this would be a change and shift from how bankruptcy law works right now toward, if you're a fossil fuel company, saying if you are entering into this and you are insolvent, that doesn't mean you get to reconstitute yourself. It means that you come into government receivership for, and in this case, for wind down.
So to take a step back to the full-on, we're the acquisition model, let's call it. You mentioned this is something that the Federal Reserve buys companies. That's what would happen. I wonder what you make of this news from yesterday. I'm reading from a New York Times article. President Biden will withdraw his nomination of Sarah Bloom Raskin to be the Fed's top bank cop. And the concerns cited by Joe Manchin, of course, who is the Democrat who said he wasn't going to vote for her and doomed the whole thing, were that she would be kind of too zealous environmentally, that she had written a paper or made a statement at some point kind of opining, and from my reading, kind of vaguely, it's not like she seems like a hardcore lefty or anything, but about the role the Federal Reserve should play in, encouraging banks to make choices that are environmentally progressive. Do you think that this is part of the concern in the back of people's minds, that there are people who are maybe taking this conversation about nationalizing seriously?
Well, I think that, first of all, Manchin, coal baron Manchin, it's right. Oh no, don't take over my company. It's uh-oh. But I think that there is this, there has been actually a lot of mobilization, a lot of social movement focus on the role of the Fed and what it could be doing. And as that's been heating up, the Fed has been, coming out with some better rulings on these things. This was another moment to push that forward and use this as a tool, as it should be, to stabilize and build out a climate safe country that or climate safe United States. I think that like this is not the first time we've seen something like this. Like there was also Saleh Omarova's nomination that got stopped because honestly of red baiting and this concept that like, oh, she's like too much of a Russian socialist or some BS like that. And
Russian socialist.
Yeah, like yikes. Okay, really? But I think that it's showing that like we're actually, I think the thing that scares people, particularly the right, is like as we are ascending, like we want to use the tools of government. Like progressives actually want to use them and like for the social good. And like that is something that is very daunting if you are on the right or if you like have too many shares in a coal company, for instance, like Joe Manchin.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like this is a moment. I remember early in the, I guess, COVID, spring of 2020, as the primaries were winding down and as we were talking about what this COVID relief was going to look like, there were these articles that said, the amount of bailout for the airline industry is enough to just buy the airline industry. And I remember thinking, like, this seems like a really bad financial decision. Why not just buy the airline? It's like having a car that was only worth $15,000 and paying $20,000 to get it repaired. My friend, buy a new car. You know what I mean? What is the sentimental value we have in our old Peugeot? Like, buy a new car. I certainly don't have any sentimental value attached to the airline industry. Why isn't there? Why aren't there bigger calls for these things in this moment? Why does the left seem so neutered, almost afraid of its shadow in making these kinds of demands? Because even if you don't think that this is practically going to work, even if you think that we're not at a point socially and politically where we would get nationalization, it seems to me that at least if there's this stick of a threat that there is a substantial portion of the population calling for nationalization, let's say the 30% of Democrats who were supportive of Bernie Sanders, if he were to make these kinds of calls, that there might be a compromise position that would be scads better than where we are right now.
Oh, man. Oof. I think like this, like the Reagan era totally exerted so much, like gutted the left in so many ways. I think like it really did affect like the cultural understanding of like the fact that we can own things and that like public government can work well. And also just like the privatization of public entities in that time, the outsourcing that happened, I think also hurt people's conception of the public institutions being able to do good things for them. And so I think that there's like a real like cultural project that has to be that like we can build things and they can be good and they can be owned by us. This like concept of community and public control, because it's a lot of taking back after like decades of neoliberalism that pervades our society.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we are in a really uphill situation, because they have, in fact, created a government that is not very good at doing things. Right?
Very effectively and like on purpose, too.
Right. So there is, you do have to fight against the realistic perception, like the not incorrect perception that the government's ability to be effective has been neutered, and also make the case that we can make it better and then it can work better than the private industry. But yeah, Republicans are wily and they're very good at this. I mean, Matt, I've heard you kind of go back and forth about whether or not the word nationalization is accurate in terms of what has happened in the past, namely in 2008. But do you have any thoughts about, from a kind of a messaging perspective, if that's something we should take head on and say, actually, the government can do good things? Here are all these historical precedents. Remember how much you love the Tennessee Valley Authority, Grandpa? Or you think, given the sensitivity around that word, we should just kind of stealth do it and stealth advocate for it the way it was done in 2008 and basically wrap it in Obama and say, your favorite guy did it. Let's try this again. It's a crisis.
Yeah, messaging's always tough. And in reality, your opponents are going to use the word anyways. So it's not like you're going to be able to escape it. I do think, with TVA, I think that's a really good example. And that's a different case because we're talking about building an institution from scratch. And people do love that. It's really funny, as much as people, the S word, socialism and nationalization, those things can be kind of real hot button for some people. But in polling, and I think even just in general, people are the actual socialist institutions we have, meaning like our state-owned enterprises and public utilities and stuff like that, it's not, you don't see a whole lot of heat about that. People really get kind of heated about the welfare state and, cultural issues. Not that, I don't mean to demean those, but whatever, what people put in that bucket. But people love the post office. In Tennessee, they love TVA. In fact, Obama tried to privatize TVA, and it was state Republicans that made it impossible for him to do that. They love, I don't know if they love Amtrak so much, but
well, Joe Biden does. Maybe that can be the stick to prod him.
Joe loves that. There's this Amtrak station named after Joe.
Right.
So, and people, public utilities, you get maybe some back and forth depending on how you feel about yours personally. But public production doesn't really face the same kind of, it doesn't really set off the right as much. Like the rank and file right wingers, they're upset about critical race theory and trans rights and stuff like that. They're not really banging the table for privatizing the postal service or something like that. When it comes to taking over existing entities, I do think there's at least a way to talk about it, like you were hitting at, where especially if they're in need of assistance, you could kind of hit upon, look, if we're going to give you taxpayer money, you got to give the taxpayers a good deal or something like that, like we're going to ask of you the same thing that a private financer would ask of you. A private financer is not giving you money equivalent to 30% of your equity stake with no voting rights. So why does the public have to do that? I think there's a reasonable maybe way to kind of draw an equivalence there and say, look, we're not going to get ripped off. We're going to get the same deal that a private investor would get here. And if you were in this kind of dire financial situation and you're about to collapse, they would ask for a lot, and they certainly would ask to be in the driver's seat.
I want to put a fine point on how possible this is, because as I try to make these lists, as I'm doing right now, of common pushbacks from liberals, it's that things that are obviously good, but which haven't been very publicly considered by the politicians that they admire and they think of as #good people. They tend to do this kind of just world hypothesis thing, where you try to make sense of that cognitive dissonance by saying, well, it must just not be possible. It must be out of reach. If Obama didn't do it and he's a real mensch, it must just not be possible. So there's a part of your paper, Johanna, that talks about executive action. What could be done right now? What kind of moves could Joe Biden make in this moment that could start us along the right path?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that, one, there are ways for him to start constraining the industry, and working to end subsidies that he has control over, working to end kind of the, implementing when it's right, import or export bans, like these things that are actually going to make the fossil fuel industry cringe. And he actually he has some power over stopping drilling. And so that actually could potentially put them in a situation in which they're clamoring for that government receivership.
Oh, well, Johanna, that's the opposite of what's happening. All of the incentives right now are for him to drill more and to subsidize more because people are paying so much at the pump.
Well, but then that's where we can bring in some of the I think it's a combination of demand side and supply side, right? So the supply is okay, we can't work with people at the pump. What we need to do is ramp up our production of renewable energy as quickly as possible. Start transforming those systems as we're winding down the oil and gas industry, so that we are no longer dependent on this volatile, commodity oil and gas. So I think there are, and also we already have things like the strategic petroleum reserve that they have unleashed that Biden has control over. But are there ways for us to actually extend that so that we're managing our oil and gas production in a way that actually is relevant to geopolitics and to climate goals as well?
Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.